Guten Tag. This is the 11th and final presentation in this particular series on the history of the Russian German. There will undoubtedly be other presentations on the Russian German from a historical point of view, but this will finish up this kind of broad narrative where I started with the Manifesto of Catherine II in 1763 and am going all the way up to present day. And so this presentation will deal with the period of time from the decree of 13th of December 1955, releasing the remaining Russian Germans, those that were over 16, those that had either been deported from western regions of the Soviet Union or forcibly repatriated from outside the Soviet borders into the USSR, releasing them from the special settlement restrictions. And as a practical matter, most of the actual release occurring in January and February 1956. And in February 1956, something else occurring that is directly related to the changes in the legal system and the position socially of the ethnic Germans and other deported peoples in the Soviet Union at this time. Nikita Khrushchev consolidates his power at this time, and he gives a secret speech at the 20th Party Congress that denounces some but not all of Stalin's crimes. Among those crimes he denounces are the deportation of some but not all of the nationalities subjected to wholesale deportation by the Soviet government during the Second World War. He specifically notes the Chechens, the Ingush, the Karachais, the Balkars, and the Kalmuks. He deliberately excludes the Volga Germans and the Crimean Tatars. And so these are two groups of people deported in their entirety that had national territorial structures, the Volga German ASSR and the Crimean ASSR, that were permanently eliminated. And so they are not allowed to return to their homeland or areas from which they had been living prior to World War II. The decree of 13th December 1955 explicitly prohibits the Germans from returning to their former places of residency and explicitly prohibits them from seeking compensation for property lost during the deportation. So they remain confined to areas of the Soviet Union east of the Urals, European areas of the Soviet Union, the Volga region, Ukraine, Crimea, the North Caucasus, Transcaucasia, these areas that had over 1 million ethnic Germans in them in 1939 are completely, almost ethnically cleansed of the German population. There are very few remaining Germans west of the Urals in the European areas of the Soviet Union following World War II. The vast majority of them having been loaded up at bayonet point and taken into cattle cars and dumped out into the wasteland of northern Kazakhstan, western Siberia, and in some other areas, for instance, Krasnoyarsk Krai is technically in eastern Siberia. So these areas were basically stripped of their German population. The German presence had been in places like the Volga since 1764, a little bit later in Ukraine, Crimea, and the Caucasus was erased. These people no longer inhabited these areas. They've been completely removed, a number of them dying in the process, so between 20 and 25% of the ethnic German population of the Soviet Union dying prematurely due to Soviet policies of deportation conditions in the special settlement, forced labor in the labor army between 1941 and 1948. But the surviving majority is confined after the release from the special settlement restriction and the dismantlement of the labor army. They are still confined to the Asian eastern parts of the Soviet Union, mostly Siberia and Kazakhstan and Central Asia, as well as the Urals and some other areas in the Soviet Union that are technically in Asia. The Soviet Far East has a small German population. This means that there's been a complete change in their geography and a complete dispersal of them across Asia, out of Europe. And they attempt to integrate themselves economically into the areas where they have been forcibly resettled, in Siberia and Kazakhstan. And they are allowed now, with the removal of the special settlement restriction, some freedom of movement within Asian areas of the Soviet Union. So there is considerable migration southward into Kazakhstan and other parts of Central Asia, particularly Kyrgyzstan. The Kyrgyz population of ethnic Germans in Kyrgyzstan will grow considerably, up to 100,000 by the time the Soviet Union ends. And the vast majority of this population are people migrating after the Second World War from Kazakhstan and Siberia and the Urals, other places in eastern regions of the USSR, into Kyrgyzstan. There was a German population already in Kyrgyzstan, but it grows considerably during this time. There's also growth in the German population in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, but smaller. The German population in Tajikistan gets up to about 30,000, and in Uzbekistan, some 45,000. But in Kyrgyzstan, 100,000, which, given the population of Kyrgyzstan, makes it a fairly substantial minority. About 2% of the total population. And of course, in Kazakhstan, you get the largest group. Germans become something like 7% of the population of Kazakhstan. Over 1 million ethnic Germans are in Kazakhstan by the time the Soviet Union ends. More ethnic Germans in Kazakhstan than in all of the Russian Federation, RSFSR, at the time the Soviet Union breaks apart, finally, in the early 90s. Right? So the last Soviet census in 1989 clearly shows that the largest number of ethnic Germans in any republic in the USSR is in Kazakhstan, with more than 1 million people. So these are demographic trends that are going, but more importantly, I think what is happening as far as attempts to rehabilitate the ethnic Germans, to try and reclaim the rights and status that they had lost as a result of the massive repression during the Second World War. So the ethnic Germans, having been released from the special settlements, do not, like the Crimean Tatars and the North Caucasians, start to organize themselves into groups to try and restore their rights, particularly the right to return to their national homeland and restore their national autonomous territory, in this case, the Volga-German ASSR. So the Crimean Tatars have a meeting already in September 1956, where members of the Crimean Tatar community in exile that had been involved with the Crimean ASSR, had been in the Communist Party, put together a petition, send it to Moscow, and demand uh, that the Crimean ASSR be restored, that their constitutional rights as a collective nationality be restored under Soviet law. The Chechens, many of them just go and return on their own. But during this period of time, in 57, 1958, the national territories of all of the deported peoples, with the exception of the Crimean Tatars and the Volga Germans, are restored. Now, in 20th Party Congress is in February 1956, and Khrushchev gives a speech denouncing some of Stalin's crimes, but not all of them. And he denounces the deportation of the Kalmuks, the Chechens, the Ingush, the Karachais, and the Balkars. But he deliberately excludes both the Volga Germans and the Crimean Tatars from this. Now, as I said, even though they excluded the Crimean Tatars already in 1956, and then again in 1957, and continuing through this period of time after the 20th Party Congress speech, the so-called thaw, when there is a lessening of Soviet repression, a move towards socialist legality and emptying of the camps and a mass release from the special settlement, the Crimean Tatars are already active in trying to petition and persuade the Soviet government to allow them to return to a restored Crimean autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. But the Germans are much, much more timid. After the release in 1955, there is no organization. There's no groups of ethnic Germans getting together in the 1950s. What you have instead is just individuals, and like in the case of the Crimean Tatars, these are individuals that were involved in building the Soviet Union before the deportation. They were involved particularly in education in the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, and were members of the Communist Party. And these individuals writing letters to the Soviet government, but as individuals, not as petitions, not as collective endeavors yet. And two individuals stand out. Dominic Holman started writing already in 1956, asking that the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic be restored, and that the Germans in exile in Kazakhstan and Siberia be allowed to return. Adolf Birsch starts writing such letters in 1957. Well, both of these people are just individuals, not groups. And one of the things that we see in particular about the case of the Germans is that they are not nearly as active, despite the fact that they are the single largest of the deported peoples, in stressing their rights and demanding a right of return, demanding restoration of their national territory. But unlike the other deported peoples, they do have a champion in the West German government, which is founded in 1949. So the West German government, among other things, it considers all of the ethnic Germans that came under its rule in the Soviet Union when the Nazis were in power to be German citizens. Right? So those Germans, so we are talking 200,000 or so people, minus those that did not survive the wartime and immediate post-war repression of the Soviet Union, were considered German citizens by the West German government, and therefore had the right to settle in West Germany. And negotiations between the West German government and the Soviet government led to an agreement to reunify families from these people that had been split. So if they had relatives in West Germany, the West German government got a commitment on 6th of April 1958 for the Soviet government to allow them to emigrate and come to West Germany. Now this is only a little less than 13,000 people, and the migration only lasts for 2 years, 1958 to 1960. But this is important. This is the first post-war emigration of ethnic Germans that the Soviet Union allows. The 13,000 coming out between 58 and 1960, family reunification, people that the German government considered to be German citizens because they had been issued citizenship during the Nazi occupation of the western regions of the USSR. Right? So this is the first steps. But technically, under German law, starting in 1953, all ethnic Germans in communist countries, including the Soviet Union, including ethnic Germans in Central Asia, were eligible to return to become Aussiedler, settlers abroad, to Germany and become German citizens and receive assistance in integrating. Now, at this time, the West German government did not expect there to be huge amounts. Right, 13,000 people from 58 to 1960 is not a lot. And the later waves we'll see are also small up until the end of the Soviet Union. And then it becomes a huge flood. So there is this champion. And in addition to limited emigration at this time, the West German government wants to improve conditions for the ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union. And so, as part of normalizing of relations with West Germany, on 29th of August 1964, and so this is the day after the anniversary of the decree by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet for the deportation, which accused the ethnic Germans of treason en masse without any evidence whatsoever. There is a partial rehabilitation order. And it's partial in that the Soviet government now admits that the claims of mass treason by the ethnic Germans was completely made up, that it was there was no evidence whatsoever. The decree clearly says that the ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union during the Second World War were loyal Soviet citizens. They contributed to the victory over the Nazi Germany, in Soviet parlance are called the fascists, right? Although the Italians were not really involved at all. And that they had contributed greatly, mainly through their labor and work. However, they had become rooted in their new places of settlement, particularly in Kazakhstan and Central Asia. And this spurs a collective movement by ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union, starting in Frunze, which is the old name for Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, to get together to figure out how to organize to approach the Soviet government and ask that the Volga-German ASSR be restored and that they be given the same rights as they had before 1941 in the Soviet Union, right? The rights that were restored to the Chechens and the Ingush, the Karachais and the Balkars and the Kalmuks. So there is a delegation organized originally the 2nd January 1965, where they meet with Mikoyan, who becomes the point man for Soviet nationality policies, particularly deported peoples, probably because he's Armenian, but he's also the only member of the Politburo that abstained as opposed to voting for these mass deportations during the Second World War. So he was somebody that during the deportations officially did not vote for it, but abstained. But also during the Khrushchev era, he is on record as condemning the national deportation. And there's a second meeting then in June. A delegation is even larger with McCoyan in 15th of June, I think 1965. Both of these delegations don't get anywhere. A third delegation is attempted in 1967 to meet with the Central Committee, but it gets nowhere at all. And the movement to restore the Volga German ASSR basically disintegrates and collapses. And the new German national movement arising in the early 1970s, 1972, 1973, really gets underway, is completely different in that its goal is no longer a restoration of the Volga German ASSR, but to secure the right to emigrate out of the USSR and go to West Germany and take up the offer of the West German government to be West German citizens due to the fact that they are ethnic Germans who are being denied their full rights because of their German blood and German heritage. So this is what really characterizes political movements insofar as they exist. Again, the Germans are far more passive than, for instance, the Crimean Tatars on the issue of pushing for the restoration of their civil rights. But there is still this, a number of activists that are engaged in first the movement to try and restore the Volga German ASSR, and second, the movement to emigrate out of the Soviet Union to West Germany. Now, Mikoyan was very honest with the German delegation. He says, the reason we can't let you leave Kazakhstan in particular is because the rural economy in northern Kazakhstan would collapse. You are the only reliable core workforce in those regions. This is why we noticed that the German population in Kazakhstan, growing at this time, has already had half of the deportees from 1941 on, as well as a significant number of Germans who were already there before the Second World War. And so it soon becomes the largest German population in the Soviet Union as far as republics are concerned, overtaking the RSFSR. And by the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, we have over 1 million ethnic Germans in Kazakhstan. So the Germans come to the conclusion that they're never going to be full citizens. They will always be discriminated against because they are German, particularly in where they can live. Right? Up until 2nd of November 1972, they are formally banned from 3rd of November, I'm sorry. Up until 3rd of November 1972, they are still formally banned as an entire nationality from living in the western regions of the Soviet Union. They are not allowed to return to the areas from which they had been deported. They are not allowed to live in areas of the Soviet Union that are west of the Urals and in the European region. So they are confined to the Asian areas and bloc. And this is one piece of discrimination that exists, and this is the formal piece of legislation still on the books in the Soviet Union. As I said, it's only formally repealed 3rd of November 1972. And it's interesting why it's repealed, as I'm going to tell you, and something that will blow your mind. It is repealed because the next year the Soviet Union is co-sponsored with Guinea, which is a left-wing pro-Soviet government, although not one of the completely communist ones that occurred in 1974 and 75 in Ethiopia, Angola, and Mozambique. But Secure Torre emulates many of the policies of the Soviet Union and has close relations with. So Guinea and the USSR collaborate in the United Nations in 1973 to co-sponsor the Convention on Preventing and Punishing Apartheid, which is the system of racial discrimination in South Africa. But the 1973 United Nations definition is much broader. It does not apply merely to South Africa and Namibia, but can be applied to other analogous areas. Now, the Soviet law saying that people of German descent and ancestry, people of German blood, can only live in eastern areas of the Soviet Union, clearly violates those parts of the anti-apartheid treaty co-sponsored by the USSR and Guinea the next year that deal with restrictions on the residency and restrictions on movement and that on racial groups. And it's clearly meant by the governments of Guinea and the Soviet Union to be a condemnation of the Group Areas Act in the Republic of South Africa. And so it was very hypocritical. The Soviet Union had this still officially, yes, people who are German by race may only live in certain areas of the Soviet Union and are banned from living in other areas of the Soviet Union permanently. But we condemn this when it's done against other people in South Africa because we want to make propaganda points with the African nations and other third world countries. So that is why it is finally repealed. But in practice, most ethnic Germans are not allowed to live in European areas of the Soviet Union even after 3rd of November 1972 because they cannot get individual propiskas, that is residence permits issued by the Soviet government. But some do. Some return to the Volga, a small number. And some go to Estonia and Latvia, which has been annexed by the Soviet Union. But for the most part, even after the blanket ban is removed, they cannot settle in European areas of the Soviet Union. Another part of discrimination, systematic discrimination and admission to institutions of higher education. The ethnic Germans become the least well-educated in terms of university education population in the Soviet Union during this time. The numbers are in some of the papers get there, but it's lower than the Asian nationalities. And when you think of they were among the most highly educated, particularly in terms of literacy groups ethnically defined in the Russian Empire, this is a huge decline. So they no longer have their own territory to support institutions of higher education, and they're systematically discriminated against in admission to institutions of higher education in Kazakhstan and the various areas of Siberia to which they are largely confined. So they are basically, we have a knockdown effect, not allowed into universities, can't get the university degree, can't get certain jobs, which are the more desirable white-collar jobs in the Soviet Union, confined mainly to work in kolkhozes, agriculture, extractive industry, particularly coal mining, factory work, but for the more desirable intellectual jobs requiring a university degree, they're shut out because they can't even get admission into the university in the first place in order to get the degree. All right, so you can look at the numbers in comparison to other nationalities down in the papers and articles below here. So that's the second major grievance they have. And a third one is that even though officially in 1964 this partial rehabilitation decree by the Soviet government says that they're not guilty of treason, on a social level, and they are still consistently discriminated against on this basis, in the sense that they are consistently verbally harassed by other Soviet citizens as being Nazis, Fritzes, traitors, right, despite the 1964 rehabilitation. The decades of propaganda starting way back, we have to go back to the 19th century, anti-German propaganda but particularly intense during the 1940s, still had a serious effect upon the average Soviet citizen, particularly ethnic Russians, mindset towards those people of German descent in the Soviet Union, and the idea that because they were a German ancestry, biologically descended from German-speaking immigrants from Central Europe to the Russian Empire, that they were by definition traitors and supporters of the Nazi regime, and opponents to the Soviet Union and its cause during the Second World War. And so this consistent uh, harassment, this consistent verbal slander of children, people born way after the Second World War is over, people that had no connection possibly to the Nazis, right? People born in Siberia, people born in Kazakhstan long after the deportation, being slandered as being Nazis and guilty of the crimes of Hitler, right? School children. Right, so this is just this wears on you. This is talked a lot about in certain other contexts. But if you are a minority subjected to this type of daily uh, harassment, uh, it has a very negative mental and even physical effect upon your health. And there's been some studies about this with other minorities subjected to this types of systematic harassment. But certainly it was also a major reason, along with the official discrimination on residency, not being allowed to return to their ancestral homeland, not being allowed to have the same rights as other Soviet citizens in terms of cultural institutions supported by a national territorial formation, such as the Volga German ASSR was before 1941, and this social harassment and slander in Soviet society, and that ethnic Germans were all Nazis and guilty of the crimes of Hitler, including even small children born in exile long after the death of Adolf Hitler and the defeat of the Nazis in a big pile of rubble. Right, so this is the racialized hatred was a major reason for the decision that since they're never going to get a territory again, since they're going to be discriminated against on the basis of being a German by descent, but there's no way to maintain and develop German culture. The German language is being lost through assimilation. German language teaching and German language culture can't be sustained without the proper institution that exists for other nationalities in the Soviet Union. Right? So there's the Kyrgyz Soviet Social Republic, the Kazakh Soviet Social Republic. Both of these are dedicated to developing developing the indigenous culture, the titular culture, as well as promoting members of the titular nationality into the state apparatus, the party apparatus, and industrial jobs in those republics. Right, the Volga Germans and the other Germans in the Soviet Union have lost all of their territorial formations as a result of the 1941 deportation and the dissolving of the Volga German ASSR and the various German national rayons in Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union. So they want to emigrate, and this starting in the early 1970s, particularly after 1973, a push for the right to leave the Soviet Union and go to West Germany as Aussiedler. And there is a number of demonstrations, petitions, letters sent by ethnic Germans demanding the right to go to West Germany. They're highly influenced by the much more successful Jewish emigration movement, which has the advantage of having much stronger U.S. backing behind it. as opposed to kind of more subtle and less aggressive backing of the West German government for the Germans. But nonetheless, there is a number of ethnic Germans that are allowed to emigrate. A little over 63,000 ethnic Germans between 1971 and 1980 are allowed to leave the Soviet Union and settle in West Germany as Aussiedler. And this is the carrot part of the carrot and stick Soviet policy towards the emigration movement. The other is the stick German emigration activists that are too outspoken, that are too active, are arrested, tried, and sentenced to prison, incarceration, sometimes as long as the sentences of 3 years in prison. And there are some 40 or so ethnic German activists, places like Kazakhstan, that are arrested, incarcerated between 1974 and 1977. So this is the other part of the strategy. The Soviets stick to try and decapitate the movement by punishing its leadership, by making examples of these people to get the rest of the German population to shut up about its lack of rights, to shut up about demands to emigrate to West Germany. Again, much of the reasons the Soviet Union doesn't want them to leave are economic. They want to keep them there, particularly in northern Kazakhstan and western Siberia, because they're the core population for particularly successful agriculture in those regions. All right, so this kind of a stalemate, but things get worse after 1980. The Soviets greatly reduce the amount of German emigration allowed to West Germany between 1980 and 1987. They also have this, of course, I said, policy of arresting and incarcerating leaders in the emigration movement. Now, after 1987, the Soviet government allows free emigration out of the USSR of people who have a place to go. So if there is a nation, state willing to accept you, you can leave the USSR after 1987. So a number of diaspora groups, most notably Jews, who can now go to Israel, and ethnic Germans who can now go to West Germany, leave in large numbers. And during the period of time between 1987 and 2005, we have a huge emigration of ethnic Germans out of the Soviet Union, and then out of the post-Soviet states, particularly Kazakhstan and Central Asia, to West Germany. So in 1990 and 1991, over 147,000 Germans leaving each year, and this goes up, reaches a height in 1993 and 1994 to over 200,000. And ultimately, out of some 2 million Germans counted in the 1989 Soviet census, by the time we have the next census in the post-Soviet era, we're down to 1 million Germans in the states that used to make up the Soviet Union. Now, the largest emigration is out of Central Asia and Kazakhstan. Out of over 1 million Germans in Kazakhstan, over 830,000 have left. So there's only 170,000 Germans left in Kazakhstan. Now, the largest German population remaining is in Siberia and Russia. There's still some 600,000 ethnic Germans in the Russian Federation. So they are at a much lower level of emigration than the ethnic Germans in Kazakhstan in terms of percentage, but also total number. And the percentage of Germans leaving other Central Asian states is extremely high. However, I mentioned that the Germans in Kyrgyzstan, they got up to 100,000 people in the 1989 Soviet census, 2%. Now there are probably only about 1,000 ethnic Germans left in Kyrgyzstan. So 99% have left. And in Tajikistan, it's close to 100%. So they have all emigrated to Germany and some other areas such as Russia, but mostly to Germany. So we have just a massive exodus from Kazakhstan and particularly Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan in terms of the percentage of Germans leaving. There are, as I said, there's German settlements still in western Siberia and some in northern Kazakhstan around Akmola. There's even some old Germans left in Kyrgyzstan, but quite small. If we look at between 1950 and 2005, over 2 million ethnic Germans leaving the Soviet Union to go to West Germany. Vast majority of that from 1990 to 2005. By the time which it becomes just a trickle compared to what it was in the early 1990s. And the mass reduction, particularly in Kazakhstan, of the German population through emigration. So now most of the Russian Germans who grew up in the Soviet Union and their children are actually living in Germany now rather than in the former Soviet Union. The second largest population is now back in Russia, no longer in Kazakhstan, where it had been for much of the post-Soviet period, and the fairly large German population in Kyrgyzstan almost completely gone as a result of emigration. So by 2006, the German population had gone from over 2 million in 1989 down to 830,000 or so. So it's a massive decline and decrease due to people emigrating. And now most of these people that emigrated can no longer speak German, speak Russian as their primary language, have been heavily Sovietized in terms of their day-to-day life and day-to-day culture, the way they lived, particularly use of the Russian language. But mentally, because they were systematically being discriminated against and persecuted for all of these decades because they were identified as German, they internalized this and identified themselves as Germans as well. And this is why it's really a racial consciousness rather than an ethnic consciousness, because the ethnic signifiers, particularly the use of the language, were impossible for most of them to sustain, particularly as we became more and more generations born after the Second World War. And so coming to an end now to the history here, we still have some remnants in western Siberia and in places in northern Kazakhstan around Akmola. A few traces in Kyrgyzstan, and the situation is slightly better in terms of numbers in Uzbekistan. But for the most part, the situation for ethnic Germans in Central Asia proper, particularly in terms of numbers, is the worst, considerably worse than Kazakhstan, which is considerably worse than Siberia. And most of the emigration having gone to West Germany, but integration and yet alone assimilation into the larger already existing German population in West Germany and then unified Germany has been very, very difficult. It has not been easy. Been a lot of marginalization socially and economically of returning a Russian German from particularly Kazakhstan and Central Asia into modern Germany. And so the history here, we have a full circle. This is the single largest movement of Russian Germans in their many histories, in their many moves historically. Folk auf dem Weg, they're constantly moving. So this movement from Kazakhstan, Central Asia, and Russia into Germany during the 1990s is larger than the German emigration out of the Russian Empire to Canada, United States, and Argentina during the 19th and early 20th centuries. In terms of numbers, it is larger than the numbers deported eastward by the Stalin regime into Siberia and Kazakhstan in the fall of 1941. Right, we were talking 800,000 deportees between September and November 1941, whereas the emigration between 1990 and 2006 is over 2 million people, so more than double the number of people involved, and all of them coming into Germany, which did not exist as a unified state when their ancestors left to go to the Russian Empire starting in 1763. All right. Germany only became a unified state in 1871. So these are people that left Central Europe before there was a Germany and are now coming back to a new German state, one that is the third iteration of a modern German state. So we have the Second Reich, unified in 1871, and then we have Weimar Germany, which morphs into Nazi Germany for 12 years, but the Republican form of government. And then finally, the Federal Republic of Germany formed in 1949 after the Second World War, a completely and totally different type of republic than existed under Weimar Germany, and one that is radically different, of course, from the Nazi dictatorship that exists from 1933 to 1945. So really, the fourth iteration, actually, if we consider Nazi Germany separate from Weimar Germany, since 1871. But almost all of the people that are returning as now Spätaussiedler, late settlers abroad, from Kazakhstan, Central Asia, and Russia into Germany are descendant of people who migrated out of German-speaking states in Central Europe between 1763 and 1871. So they would have been the migrants would have been right before Germany is unified in the Second Reich under Otto von Bismarck. All right, so I'm not going to go into kind of the modern social problems. It's not really my area of expertise, but I wanted to cover the movements, try and restore the Volga German ASSR. It was a failure. The demographic shifts southward, particularly into Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan during the post-Soviet era. The continuing discrimination by the Soviet government and by the larger Russian-dominated Soviet society against the ethnic German minority. And finally, emigration movement, which basically is successful in being internalized by almost all of the Russian German population. Certainly the vast majority of it acting upon this realization that the only way to have our rights as people of German ancestry is to leave the Soviet territory of the Soviet Union and go to Germany. And we see the fact that the majority, over half people who are German by nationalnost leave the Soviet Union and the successor states and go to Germany. So we now have considerably less than half as many Germans living in the territories that were formerly part of the Soviet Union than we did in 1989. So it's been a massive shrinkage through emigration. All right, so that pretty much sums up the history. Unfortunately, the modern history of my ethnic group of many people watching this, not a good one. I'm not happy, but that's the cards we're dealt. But I think it's important that we remember it. I think it's important that this influence that we have in our lives, that it be preserved, and not just in some kind of happy, funny, ethnic way. We celebrate, we eat bratwurst and drink beer, but really know the history and warts and all. All right.